Are you a woman in the corporate world striving to break barriers, challenge unconscious bias, and lead the way for women in leadership roles globally? If so, this is the podcast for you. Introducing Leading Ladies Who Lunch. The lunch hour is usually the time when colleagues get together for real, honest conversations about work, life, and everything in between. In each episode of Leading Ladies Who Lunch, we'll delve into insightful discussions and share actionable strategies to help you navigate corporate life. Co-hosted by me, Cicy George, a leadership development architect and inspirational speaker. I'm thrilled to share my experience and expertise on leadership, mentorship, and organizational intelligence to help you own your career.
And me, Rachel Lowndes, CEO and founder, imposter syndrome expert, and mindset coach at Rachel Lowndes Coaching and Consulting. Passionate about helping women conquer imposter syndrome and unleash their inner confidence to get the recognition and promotions they deserve.
Jam-packed with insightful conversations, expert advice, and inspiring stories from a diverse group, we'll explore how to overcome obstacles, shatter those glass ceilings, and build unshakable mindsets to unlock your true potential. So whether you're sipping a coffee or enjoying a meal at your desk, tune in for a no-host bar lunchtime chat. Episodes will be dropped every 2 weeks. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button.
Leading Ladies Who Lunch, empowering women, one conversation at a time.
Welcome back to the Leading Ladies Who Lunch podcast.
Hey, Cicy, always good to see your face. I'm excited to dive into today's episode. So, Cicy, why don't you give us the lowdown on what we're going to be chatting about today?
Absolutely. And great to see you again, Rachel. Okay, so all of us have had our share of experiences with good and not so good leaders, right? I certainly have seen so many different examples of what a leader is. And there are so many qualities that a professional would need to demonstrate to be considered the kind of leader that you would like to work with, right? So for one, you've got all of the technical and business knowledge that you need to be qualified to handle that level of work. But then you have the skills that, you've heard this phrase before. So many people refer to it as the quote unquote soft skills. And I hate saying that because I feel like they are the absolute necessary skills of leadership.
Great.
It requires skills that aren't so apparent on the surface. And earlier in my career, I would work with horrible bosses. And for some reason, I accepted that is what leadership is. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that's not what leadership is. In fact, it was quite the opposite of that. And then I also came to a even deeper realization that while I cannot control how others model leadership, what is within my sphere of control is demonstrating what great leadership looks like in whichever role that I'm in, right? So that's why great leadership really boils down to a set of behaviors. And that's what today's episode is all about. What makes a great leader? Now, leadership is one of those subjects that has mountains of research and theory and material that's available to everyone out there. We can spend hours sharing about it, but I find that it helps to hear from other people's experiences. So, Rachel, I'm curious. I'm sure you've had your fair share of good and not so good leaders that you've worked with. Can you tell us about some of what you've observed, whether it was good or bad, and how that impacted you individually?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I would say I've probably had more not so good leaders than great leaders. And there is a difference between, a good leader and being a great leader in my experience, because good leaders are, they're doing their best, but maybe they haven't learned what it takes to be a great leader. Whereas, bad leaders are a whole different world. And any leader, whether good or bad, can have a massive impact on our careers. Now, unfortunately, I've had some leaders who were just downright bullies. Some were borderline questionable in regards to their treatment of females in the office too, but we'll leave that one there. And others that were on the surface just kind of seemed to be like winging it a little bit. So when I moved to Australia, I had a manager who didn't really seem to do anything. And I know it's easy for us to say that, though, but given the kind of work that we did, it felt to me like, we really needed systems and processes in place so that we could adequately do our roles. And these just weren't there. So a lot of the time I felt like I was carrying the weight of his job by putting those systems and processes into place to make us efficient and better. But he was taking all the credit for it, right? So, and that's kind of a bad leader move on a lot of levels, isn't it?
Right. Very typical.
Yeah. So, in order for me to survive in that job, I kind of had to make him look good. And I had to back down on the fact that, I owned those processes and systems. And it was almost like that kind of managing him in terms of, well, I had to make it look like it was his idea all the time, whereas in fact it was mine. So, his decision making really kind of was quite alarming. I mean, I just thought he was a little bit of a fake, to be honest, like an actual imposter, and rare thing, right? And
right.
and so the result of this is that he was kind of terrified of being exposed, particularly by me. So he would overshadow me. He would micromanage me. He told me and my colleague multiple times that our jobs were in jeopardy, when in actual fact, it was his mismanagement that was causing the issues with the leadership team and not our work specifically. But we were made to feel like it was our fault. So, he sidelined me. He put more work on me than was humanly possible for anyone to manage. So he overloaded me with work, you know what I mean? And his behavior towards me was noticed by others because I wasn't allowed to do things that other people seemed to be able to do.
Wow.
Yeah. So this isn't actually the first time this has happened to me in my career either, right? The same cycle repeated itself 4 years ago in my last permanent job in advertising.
Whoa.
So, I've always been professional in my role and delivered, but in the end, I had to leave that job. I had to leave other jobs, and in many cases, I've also been made redundant. So at the time of that manager and that working situation, I was also going through a horrible breakup. So mentally, I needed support from my workplace, but I didn't get that either. So, the impact of all of those things kind of coming together and compounding meant that I was doubting my abilities. I stopped trusting my instincts, and I believed that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Right. And even though I left that role, I struggled to reconnect with my career after that. I lost my passion. I felt like I was floating through life, not really achieving much. And leadership became then a very negative thing for me. It's like a kind of dictatorship, like not something I really wanted for myself. So I didn't pursue it, which is a shame, because I did have opportunities and people that did think that I was capable, but I didn't go for them and I shied away from them, which, the result is that it affected my career trajectory. It affected my ability to earn money and all these other things that kind of as a result of, one or two really bad leaders.
Wow. There is so much to unpack there. And I always feel like, that saying goes, when it rains, it pours. So to have to go through a toxic work environment and also, going through what you were going through personally at the same time, I can only imagine, gosh, how draining life could have felt for you at the time. I also feel like yours is an experience that I've heard from so many other people before. And not to mention, I've also experienced some of what you're describing here. Right. And my biggest takeaway from all of that is how a leader's actions can have such an impact on our professional state of health, our mental state of health, and ultimately the future of our careers, which is why we're having this conversation right here.
Yeah.
I also think you're correct in saying that there are good leaders, sure, but then there are also great leaders. And great leaders, I've only seen, I can count on less than one hand how many great leaders I've seen, because they are like a diamond in the rough. I just like you, I've had more experiences with the not so good leaders or the poor leaders. And because of that, it got me thinking, this can't be what leadership is. Whenever I would observe a poor or ineffective leader in action, I always took note of what the outcome was. And I always noticed 3 recurring outcomes.
Right.
First was a lack of motivation. A
Mm-hmm.
poor leader can actually do the opposite of what they're supposed to do, which is
Yeah.
they're supposed to motivate you. But in some cases, when you have a poor leader, they actually demotivate you,
Yeah.
right?
Definitely.
Then, second thing is you have draining the energy of the team and also feeling that effect as an individual.
Mm.
Poor leaders can really just suck out the good energy. And you know this is true because I'm sure you've seen it when
Yeah.
that one poor leader leaves the room, how the energy and the vibe in the room is automatically so different. I've
Yeah.
experienced that a number of times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And
Yeah.
then everyone sort of lets out a sigh of relief, like, whew, that
Oh,
person's
yeah.
gone.
Yeah. It's like when your manager is off sick and everyone's like, yay.
Right. Party time.
Yeah.
Right. And three, instilling in others a lack of confidence. Poor
Mm.
leaders love to do that because they want to control you. So in addition to demotivating you and sucking the energy out of you, poor leaders are really good at making you believe that you are not capable
Yeah.
and somewhat lesser
Mm-hmm.
than they are and lesser than, your team members. So I think all of these factors leads to a toxic and downright ineffective work environment.
Oh,
you
totally.
know
Totally. Yeah.
i I often say to people that, even though I fondly remember the great leaders that I've had, because they are few and far between, I also remember the poor leaders I've observed,
Mm.
because it's from then that I learned such lessons about leadership.
Yeah.
And that becomes the driver for the work that I do every day. And of course, why I'm here doing this with you today.
Mm.
And so to balance what I've observed with the poor leaders,
Yeah.
I also work with leaders I thought were really great because they did a few things I thought was really great.
Right.
One, they instilled confidence in my abilities beyond even what I thought was possible. So
Mm.
there's a book written by John Gordon called The Power of Positive Leadership. And he mentions in that book, he notes that one of your key responsibilities as a leader is to instill more belief in your team than they have in themselves. And
Yeah.
I was fortunate that I did work with one or two leaders who I did feel that they believed in me more than I believed in myself.
Yeah. You
So
need
that's
your
really
leader to have
powerful.
your back, really, don't you? It's
Exactly.
like borrowed
100%.
confidence. Yeah.
Exactly. I love the way you said that.
Yeah.
The second thing is they empowered me with autonomy and decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just wrap this up with, the last thing was they included me on really big resume building opportunities,
Oh,
and these
yeah.
were opportunities that I would not have had otherwise if I was in any other role. And it's so monumental for my career because it gives me a sort of footing or a stamp, and to even for anyone who's out there, any of the leaders that I had the good fortune of working alongside with who might be listening right now, from the bottom of my heart, I truly thank you.
Mm.
And I think it's important to also remind ourselves that people who are in a leadership position, at the end of the day, they're still human, right?
Yeah.
Nobody gets it 100% right all the time. And it's hard to be a quote unquote perfect leader all day long. I had to remind myself to give others grace. And
Yeah.
over the years, I guess I just realized I had to stop putting them on a pedestal, number one, because they didn't ask to be put there.
So
And
true.
number two, they are human just like you and I.
Yeah.
I no longer see people in a high level executive position as knowing more than me or being better than me.
Mm.
So, Rachel, based on that, I'm curious, how has your perspective of great leadership changed over the years?
Well, it's interesting what you say about, there's a human at the center of this at the end of the day, and no one is perfect. We're all just trying our best. And it's really kind of important to remember that, I think, especially in the
Right.
workplace, if you've got some sort of conflict going on as well.
Exactly.
It's good to remember that there's a human at the heart of all of this. But I have a totally different perspective on leadership now because I understand it better and what it actually means. So, I'm really passionate about it and developing these skills for myself and through the work I do. And of course, on this podcast, working with you, like someone with your skills and your knowledge. I mean, it's a real honor to be here with you all the time. So that's good. No, it really is. I start, I stopped viewing it as a means to control, and that's kind of touching on what you said before, and started to look at it through the lens of how can a good leader be helpful, right? Like that's kind of the job of the leader. Like we've all had that moment where a bad leader defined what we think and believe what leadership is about, but executing that is a lot harder. And leadership has many elements, right? As you know, right? You have to lead from the front at times, but it also means you got to lead from the back. And I think there's some sort of this thing about a wolf pack, like the leader of the wolf pack is at the back and the slowest wolf is at the front. And the reason for that is so that no one gets left behind. And
right.
There's something quite cute about that. Anyway, I've gone a bit off topic there, but what I mean by that is that you're supporting yourself to grow and shine all the time, and it's important to define a common goal that you're working towards and the general direction, so that everyone can get on board with it, so they know what they're doing and why, so they can be fired up. And we can all achieve something collaboratively and together. There's a lot of talk about being collaborative and all that kind of thing. Well, there's a way to do that. It doesn't just happen. You have to make it happen, right? So many leaders don't take the time to get to know their staff or what they're passionate about either, right? So like you're working with people. They're not just a commodity. They're not just a resource, right? They're not just come in, stamp out, and that's time. Like, you buy time of people, but they're people. So there's a real human element. And I think I see a lot of that coming into leadership talk now about how we need to inject some humanity and some compassion and some kindness. Right. Right. And so the other thing is like, you really don't have to be the smartest person in the room to be a great leader. And in fact, I would say that if you are, then you're doing something wrong, because you should have smarter people than you around you, because that helps build up the team. It helps build them up. Ideally, you want to be making leaders out of the people that you've got in your team. That's the ideal, isn't it? That's the purpose of leadership, essentially. So you want to be making each other better. You want to identify where each person contributes the best and help them leverage that and build upon those skills that can make them better. It's about motivating, inspiring, all these things that you want out of a leader. Be that person, right?
Right.
It's not about being right. It's about being curious. So, of course, leaders do have a responsibility to make decision, because there are many parts to consider. Like you do want someone who does make decisions, which is why there isn't like a one size fits all. You don't just fit into one category. And I think Daniel Goleman in his work identified 6 different leadership styles. So they are authoritative, coaching, coercive, pace setting, democratic, and affiliative. You could probably look those up online. I won't talk about them here, but you could definitely look them up and see a bit more about them. But a great leader should have a nice balance of all of these, because as humans, we do have a dominant aspects of ourselves. You might be a bit more authoritative at times, but it's about understanding how you can bring those other elements in, so that you're not just being a dominating leader, because no one really wants that, right?
Right.
So, being aware of when that happens and noticing when those parts are useful or destructive. Like, as I say, sometimes you need a leader to be making decisions, and that's where the authoritative part will come into it. So, Cicy, what about you? What's your perspective? How has your perspective on leadership changed over the years, especially with like the kind of work that you've done and the training and study as well?
Sure. I love what you said about leading from the back. I really like that. I think, also surrounding yourself with people who are smarter than you, very well said, Rachel. Yeah, I think, certainly it's changed over the years. I would say it changed drastically. And the biggest change for me was understanding that no matter what job you're in, what level you are or status, you are modeling leadership to someone else, because there is always someone who is observing and taking note of how you show up, what you do, what you say, whether or not you have integrity. And I had to learn that because of what people would tell me. People would come up to me after a meeting and say, wow, I really like the way you handled that,
Right.
mini conflict we had back
Mm.
there.
Right.
Meanwhile, I'm not realizing I did anything spectacular. I'm just showing up the way that I normally would. So for people to come up and tell you, hey, I'm really taking notice of what you're
Mm.
doing, what you're saying, how you present yourself,
Yeah.
that's why I firmly believe that leadership is, sort of, it's everything you do that is, presented in front of other people. Because someone is taking note of it and going, oh, that Rachel, yeah, I really like the way she presents herself in the office when she's doing board meetings. Or I really love the way Cicy is, holding her executive presence. People are watching.
Mm.
So I think it's, no matter your level, it's more of a state of being. It's more of a mindset. You're starting to hear the leadership chatter, move from what you describe as being very authoritative and like a dictatorship almost. That
Yeah.
was, probably a good like 20, 25 years ago,
Yeah.
even 15. But I think that leadership wave has evolved, and now you're seeing more of the humanism
Yeah.
coming to the forefront. So you're
Mhm.
you're finding people who are really diving deep into leadership being and humanizing leaders. So that's why we talk a lot about you and I, and what we're just saying about looking at them as people, because
Yeah.
people, when we're working in business, it's all about relationships, right? So I think, taking note of the behaviors that you demonstrate, I think, that has certainly influenced my perspective of leadership and also my career, because I used to view leadership as a title. And
Right.
only when you held that title did people consider you a leader.
Yeah.
So for
So
me,
wrong.
right? I spent much of my career chasing that because it was my own belief that only if I got to a certain level would I be taken seriously. But it
But we're
wasn't
kind
until
of taught that, really, aren't we? That's how
we
it is.
are.
Yeah.
We are, because these people who are in higher level positions, they're almost glorified.
Mm.
They're seen as separate from the pack. They are, privy to information that you are not privy to.
Yeah.
They are privy to
Club.
benefits that you
Yeah.
aren't. Yes, exactly. Some people might even say they're part of the Illuminati.
Yeah. Does
So
feel like that sometimes. Yeah.
right. So, I spent much of my career chasing that. And I started, once I started to take more value in myself and my knowledge and experience and talents and, my emotional intelligence and how I show up every day, I feel like that more than my title
Mm.
qualifies me as a leader. And that's my new lever of leadership. So with that, you know, I sort of shifted my ways of thinking about leadership. And since it's no longer what I'm trying to chase in my career, I'm now looking at leadership as what I'm already doing. But instead of, I'm looking for ways that I can build things and make things happen for myself instead of waiting for others to do it for me, like for someone to promote me or someone to give me that executive level job. I'm trying to do that for me. You
Mm.
know, I'll also add that I also realize that emotional intelligence is really that distinguishing qualifier for me that sets leaders apart, that
Mm.
goes from good to great.
Mhm.
I had this one leader who did not make an effort to connect with her team as human people. Like you said, Rachel, you said, earlier, we're all people at the end of the day. We all have, thoughts and emotions, and we're all complex.
Mm.
And this one leader just would not, because she doesn't view work like that. She keeps
Right.
her work and personality separate from each other. And so, because of that, she was labeled as emotionally unintelligent. People didn't look forward to working with that person, and there was no feedback coming in either direction. And the environment felt it felt very lifeless, actually.
Right.
It's that
Mm.
comment I made earlier, that as soon as that person is gone from the room, like the
Mm.
vibe is like different. Everyone is,
Mhm.
whew, okay, like now we can all be ourselves again.
be human and normal again. Yeah.
To be human. And so, and I know that is true because as soon as that person was no longer in that role and they brought someone else who took the reins, this new person, a much more emotionally intelligent person, took the reins, and meetings and work became more enjoyable, and the energy and the tone of the team was different. It was refreshed and exciting, and even productivity soared. It
Wow.
was almost as if someone switched the light
Wow.
on. It was that
Yeah.
much of a difference.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, emotional intelligence in leadership is a really great point that you're making there, Cici. And it's super important that we do connect with who we are authentically, as well as because we're people, right? And we're not, as I
Right.
mentioned before, we're not commodities. We're not robots. I know we're in the age of AI, but we are not robots. And actually, if you think about the success of most companies, it's because of their people and that they address that kind of people element to it. There's multiple examples of that. And understanding emotional intelligence was really my entry point into understanding leadership better, because when I studied it, I was like, wow, God, that is a game changer. And it really kind of opened my eyes, as you say, like turns the light on, right? In some ways,
Sure.
when you have someone who is different and does kind of use that emotional intelligence tool to their advantage. And I really got a lot out of understanding how I could bring more into my life. Leadership is really about understanding people, as we've kind of really talked about today. Of course, business is important, but business is also about people most of the time. So emotional intelligence and developing that is something I'd really recommend people do, like kind of at least read about more on their leadership journey, if not kind of, I mean, I think when you read about it, you're like, oh, wait, it's not really that difficult to understand. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And then you can be like, right, I know how to use that now. So yeah, it's definitely something I think people should at least read about. What are your thoughts on that, Cease?
I agree. I think it takes education, and I think it takes practice to develop. So in addition to reading more and, even just having that initial, that's like your level one of awareness.
Yeah.
I think to take it a step further and seek out level two change is to actually start to incorporate what you're reading. There are so many different resources available about how you can apply these, practices into your everyday, or incorporate practices like that into your everyday role in whatever level you're in, right? So I think it's the education, which is level one awareness, and then moving towards practice, which would be level two application. And I think if you combine those two, anyone can grow and develop as a more emotionally intelligent leader, which, to be honest, would benefit everybody.
Yeah. Can't deny that.
Not at all. All right. All right. So we have spent some time talking about our experiences with the good and the not so good leaders and the qualities that we look for. Now let's just take a pivot and talk about what are some of the ways that we can develop. We want to go from good leaders to being great leaders.
Yeah.
And for this, I always go back to this one point. You have to be clear about your values and assess and reassess them over time.
Yeah.
Because what is a value to you at the age of 20 will most likely look different by the time you're at the age of 40. And it's important to align your values with how you identify as a leader, because that dictates and influences how you show up and the types of decisions you make. Right now, I would say my top 5 values would be integrity, compassion, authenticity, passion, and grit. And when I reflect on how I show up as a leader, these values are very much the DNA of what drives me to behave the way that I do. I think you also have to reflect on what is your purpose as a leader and why do you want to lead in the first place? You've got leaders who lead projects or kind of tactical items, but then you have leaders who lead or are responsible for people. So if you want to be a leader of people, I think you have to be crystal clear about your why. Why do you want to lead people? I'm very much about people leadership because I love to coach. I love to see someone grow and develop. And if I can have a small piece of that story, I would consider myself very successful. And that's what gives me energy. So I think because of that, so because my mindset is more about service, so much of leadership is about service towards others. But if that is not your driver for wanting to be a leader of people, then I think you have to get really clear on that and align your goals to that. When I was in my early 20s, I saw the leaders around me as high-powered, glamorous, kind of mean, highly demanding people who just made significantly more money than I did. It wasn't until later that I realized leadership is not glitz and glamour. It's really about having that service mentality towards others. And of course, that emotional intelligence, because as we're saying here, business is all about relationships because it's about people. And that's an important aspect of leadership. So, growing those emotional intelligence skills are what takes leaders from good to great.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that question. Like, why do you want to be a leader? It's really pertinent, because if it's about money and status, then, sure, you might get that, but that's not really what leadership is about. And, you might end up finding yourself in that bad leader category if that's
right,
the driver for success. Yeah. So really understanding your why is quite important when it comes to deciding if leadership is for you or not. And it's not for everyone. So, don't feel bad if you decide it's not. I think leadership does show up in so many different ways. Like, you don't have to have the leadership title to be considered a leader.
Exactly.
A lot of what we're talking about today is about emotional intelligence, bringing that into your work and having that human element. And leadership is showing a lot of that, amongst other things. There's doers, there's leaders. We can't all be the same, and that's kind of okay.
Right? That is okay.
So as usual, Cicy, it's been a great chat with you. Let's just recap what we've discussed in this episode today. So we've talked about what makes a great leader, the difference and impact between good and bad leadership, and how you can start thinking about your own leadership journey, why you want to be a leader in the first place, your values as a leader, and developing emotional intelligence as a good place to start.
Absolutely. And we've said it before, but getting really clear about your values and how that shows up for you as a leader. And remember, leadership, as we're seeing here, is more than a title or your functional position. It's about being responsible for those who are in your charge, and the mindset that you adapt and your values will determine how you show up as a leader each and every day. This is all within your sphere of control. So take it, own it, grow it in whatever way fits you best. This is meant to be an ongoing journey for all of us. And it's important to understand there will be failures along the way, but how we can learn from them and just keep moving forward. Thank you all for listening to this episode of the Leading Ladies Who Lunch podcast. If you like this episode, we would be so grateful if you could share it with your friends and tag us on social media at Leading Ladies Who Lunch. Your reviews of this podcast mean so much to us. We'd love it if you could rate it and subscribe to the show.
And remember, you can find us and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcast platforms. Subscribe to stay up to date with the latest episodes, and follow us on Instagram, Leading Ladies Who Lunch.
Tune in 2 weeks, where we will be talking all about the advice we would give our younger selves.
Oh, yeah. Until then, stay sassy. Thank you for joining us on the empowering journey at the Leading Ladies Who Lunch podcast. We hope you've enjoyed our insightful discussions, actionable strategies, and inspiring stories that we break down during each episode. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to Leading Ladies Who Lunch on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And remember, the conversations you've heard on this podcast are just the beginning of your journey. Let your voice be heard, inspire change, and continue breaking barriers as you lead with authenticity, resilience, and unwavering determination.
Until next time, keep embracing your leadership potential, challenging the norms, and shaping a better world for women in the workplace. Leading Ladies Who Lunch, empowering women, changing lives.